Okay, so there's a particularly disturbing incident that's been widely reported online, and it involves a gang in Chicago who kidnapped and basically degraded and beat a young man with learning difficulties in Chicago. And the good news, not that there is any good news from this case, but I suppose the one progressive aspect is that they've been charged with a hate crime. So they haven't been, let off in that one because that's explicitly what it is. Now, during this attack, apparently they put this on Facebook Live. During the attack, they reportedly said, fuck Donald Trump, and made expletives against all white people. This was a black gang. The Chicago Police Department released pictures of the accused arrested, and the four suspects are Jordan Hill, Tresvay Cooper, Brittany Covington, and Tanisha Covington. The suspects are all 18 years old except Tanisha Covington, who is 24, according to the Associated Press. I assume she was the ringleader. Um, I'm not even going to waste adjectives to describe what I think of these people. I've always hated gangs, whether they be black, white, Asian, or Hispanic. I hate gangs, full stop. I've had some experience myself. I've been attacked on the street by groups of people like this. Well, not like this. I don't want to make comparisons to what this young man went through, but I've had some unpleasant experiences, and I I just have total contempt for them, and I just don't accept liberal logic on these sort of things. In my opinion, it's evil to knowingly do that to anyone, but particularly someone who's vulnerable. I think that's disgusting. Um, and I hope they get a very, very lengthy custodial sentence. Personally, if I were the judge, I would force him to wear t-shirts saying that they were a card. Because this was a cardly attack, 4-on-1. Um, what words are there? And this doesn't just take place in America. We get it in Britain as well. I remember seeing part of a film, Small Faces. It was set in Glasgow during the 1960s. I haven't seen the whole film, but there's this one scene that's quite disturbing, and it shows a young guy walking along minding his own business. And this gang of girls approaches him and kind of has a go at him. And when he says he doesn't fight girls, then a male gang comes and roughs him up. And it's only a film, but it shows exactly the sort of way gangs think. Another one is a Clint Eastwood film. Forget the name now, but it's about Clint Eastwood, who's kind of a bitter old war veteran with some racist tendencies, incidentally. But then he ends up defending his Hmong neighbors from an Asian gang. It's an interesting film. Um, Temporarily forget the title, but it's quite a recent film and it's a powerful film. Now, these are just films, but in the real world, we see things like this happening. And Chicago, unfortunately, is rarely in the news for a good reason. Um, about 2 years ago now, I remember another piece of footage also from Chicago. Gang of Seven attacked an individual. Whether he was a rival gang member or not, I don't know. Can't remember. But it's something gangs seem to have in common is this cowardly aspect of not being able to fight on their own. That's something that disgusts me. And when we talk about bullying and thuggery, that to me is far worse than an individual. I mean, if an individual attacks someone, it's still bad, but that aspect of pack mentality is what makes gangs, in my opinion, particularly abhorrent. Um, so the good news in this case is that the vanity of these people have implicated them. Um, sometimes digital technology can actually have a good purpose. Now, think in the past where there wouldn't have been Facebook, there wouldn't have been digital mediums. It would have been harder, perhaps, to get evidence. So that's definitely one positive aspect of this information age. And the stupidity of this gang um, is something that matches their cruelty. But the fact they've implicated themselves is wonderful because it means that there's not going to be any miscarriage of justice. They've implicated themselves, um, and I'm pleased they're being charged with a hate crime because that's what it is. Now, one aspect that's being discussed, and I want to talk a little bit about this: Black Lives Matter. There are some people linking this to Black Lives Matter. Um, well, I'll be quite honest. I've long been suspicious of Black Lives Matter as an organization, and I have serious misgivings about it. I've been quite vocal in some of my criticism. Black Lives Matter have actually condemned this. I looked at their post. They condemned it clearly. They condemned it, but they also went on to say that these teenagers won't have a chance at rehabilitation. And the post was condemning the crime, but it was kind of stating the obvious that they're going to be dealt with the full force of the law, but they seem to be advocating rehabilitation. I don't think you can rehabilitate in a case like this, and I don't think you should. So that's about as much as you can expect from Black Lives Matter. It's a bit unfair to directly say they are responsible. I don't like Black Lives Matter, but we should be fair. There's no evidence to suggest that these gang members were affiliated with them, so people should be responsible in what they're saying. Um, Also, I hold the same standards to any gang. Apparently, not so long ago, something similar happened to a young black man. Um, so wherever this happens, it has to not only be condemned, but there has to be consequences. Sticking with Chicago, though, Chicago recorded 762 homicides last year. Now, that's a 21-year record. Not since 1996 has it seen a statistic like that. That's appalling. And that's a huge spike from 2015 when there was over 400. So that's a very significant increase. Whether there's a particular gang war going on or I don't know. I came across a report on Father Flieger, I think he's called. He's a well known social campaigner in Chicago, white man who campaigns against gang violence. He's publicly said, I am a snitch. And I think he's a very brave man from what I gather. I don't know that much about him. But the point is that sometimes in these situations it's easy to get very depressed and think it's all bad. But as Father Flagger shows, there are brave people out there who are trying to do something about this. Of course, there's political aspects involved. Chicago's been controlled by the Democrats for a long time. I don't live there. I don't know enough about the issues to comment in detail about why Chicago is as bad as it is. Clearly, this can't just be put down to being a big city because New York City isn't anywhere near as bad. Um, so clearly, there's something going wrong specifically in Chicago. Although Washington, D.C. and St. Louis, as I understand, also suffer particularly high homicide rates. New York City has had a significant decrease since its 1990 peak. Should be said, though, Chicago still hasn't hit its 1974 peak. I believe that year there was 931 recorded homicides, and I believe that was a peak year. Why the 70s was so bad could be a combination of factors. The Black Panthers were active at that time, could be a number of other factors. I don't think that it's fair to directly blame Black Lives Matter, but I do think they are partly responsible for fostering an atmosphere that implies only Black Lives Matter. It's in their name. Um, but there's other aspects. I mean, whenever rappers are blamed for violence, they always say, "Oh, don't shoot the messenger. We're only saying what's going on." Well, I agree that music alone cannot be blamed on crime, obviously. But when rappers glorify gang lifestyles, and this isn't all rappers, but it's a good portion of them, when they glorify, making big money through drugs and shooting off rivals and all the rest of it, no one can tell me there's anything progressive about that. And these millionaire rappers should take some damn responsibility. Of course, they're not responsible directly, but in the end of the day, you look at gang members, they all listen to rap music. I mean, that's part of it. It really is, because it is a glorification of gang culture. I believe that is a big part of addressing this problem. There needs to be a message that no, you're not brave by joining a gang. You're not a big man, or in this case, a big woman, by joining a gang. You're just a card. Um, in the UK, the gang culture isn't quite as deeply entrenched, but in bigger cities, London, Birmingham, Glasgow, Manchester, Liverpool, there is something of a gang culture, and there's people in London that will stab you for looking at them, and that mentality needs to be absolutely purged. Definitely, very rigid punishments are a big part of it. I absolutely reject the Nordic model. I mean, if what happened in Chicago happened in Norway, they would be given a tap on the wrist and maybe put in a juvenile institution for a year, and that would be it. Now, Scandinavians might retort, oh, but we don't have crime like that. Not entirely true, actually. Just because it doesn't get reported doesn't mean it doesn't happen. And obviously, Sweden, Norway isn't as dangerous as Chicago, but yeah, I'm only mentioning that because it relates to the issue of justice and proportionality. One thing I do like about the American attitude is there is a sense of proportionality. Now, the American system is obviously has many flaws. America incarcerates more people than the rest of the world combined, and they continue to have very high crime rates in their big cities. So clearly, there's mistakes being made, but there has to be consequences for something as sadistic as this, and there shouldn't be any sob stories either about these thugs coming from poor backgrounds or whatever. I want to see black community leaders just outright condemn this with no caveats. And I say exactly the same thing with white gang members or white thugs acting in the name of Trump. And there has been examples of that. Which is another point. People who are responding to this by saying let's get all blacks, etc. That's boneheaded and it's just as bad. But I think there has to be honesty as well, and there needs to be a recognition that yeah, there is a gang culture here that is black on black. And also the fact is African Americans disproportionately make up the number of offenders. And there's just no escaping this. Now, you could say there's institutional police racism. It seems to me a lot of police departments have come a long way in terms of addressing representation. Dallas, for example, has more black officers than ever before. Um, so it's part of the equation, but I honestly think, from what I've seen, there has been big progress in that area. So there also has to be questions within the black community. Why does this community tolerate gang culture more than the white or Hispanic or Asian communities? That's not to say that the white, Hispanic, and Asian communities don't have criminals. Of course they do. And I'm not for a second making some sort of racist insinuation that black people are more naturally criminals, something like that. Of course not. But I'm just telling you the fact that there's a disproportionate number of African Americans involved in gangs. Poverty, well, there's whites in poverty. So I think there's a cultural aspect insofar as what rap music does. I'm putting it out there. Shoot me down, but whatever. Um, this culture of glorifying gang violence has to be challenged. It really does. And I think the Democratic Party is guilty of underplaying a lot of this because they're politically correct and they don't want to talk about these issues. I do think that's a big part of it. Also, it's this culture of always blaming someone else, blaming the government, blaming the police, blaming everyone but themselves. Seems to be something that's consistent with gangs and criminals. You know, this case isn't isolated. There's other cases that are just as shocking. But yeah, there's not much more to be said, really. I hope they get a very long custodial sentence. Anything short, I would argue anything short of 10 years would be a travesty, given the seriousness of this crime. And you could just imagine the psychological effects this will have on the victim. Okay, I'll leave it there. If you do live in Chicago, I'd particularly like to know your thoughts. And final point, if you're African American, please don't think I'm generalizing all African American people. I'm not. I'm really, really not. Because there's black Americans who are sick of this as much as anyone else, and who absolutely agree that criminals should face consequences. So the white nationalists and white supremacists who want to use cases like this to hate all black people, that's stupid. It's just as boneheaded as black supremacists using whatever to justify hatred of all white people.